BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill with the Farming Today podcast. This time we hear about a new study which shows racism is affecting people visiting the countryside and those living in rural communities.
There is evidence that people's experiences of racism aren't showing up in the official data as victims don't feel comfortable reporting. And if it's not reported, the police can't record it and it's not going to show up in these hate crime statistics.
We'll have more on that a little later. First, it's now being confirmed that this summer has been the hottest on record for the UK. And as we've been reporting, the drought in parts of the country has meant some livestock farmers are already relying on winter feed to supplement poor pasture. All this week, we're looking at the business of livestock feed. What's grown to feed animals and how it's produced can have a big impact on the carbon emissions of agriculture. There's pressure to make more use of homegrown protein to replace imported soya, which is often sourced from land that's been deforested. Some farmers have been feeding whole crop pulses like beans, including the stalks, to beef cattle, and around the country trials are underway to try companion planting with peas for extra protein. Sarah Falkingham has been to one farm in North Yorkshire to see more.
I'm near Richmond amongst gently rolling farmland, and I'm on a mixed beef and arable farm where there are around 340 cattle here being fattened on grass, silage, cereals, brewers' grains and some more inputs, all trying to gain just over 1.5 kilograms a day. Now, the destination retailer for these cattle long ago banned soya from the diet, so the farmer here has been using other proteins. Richard Barker, you're now trialling whole crop pulses, so stalk and all, beans and peas. Is it palatable, or why use the whole crop?
The straw, we need forage in the diet for these types of animal. It helps their stomachs work better and it makes them a much more content animal. Cattle have performed on it exceptionally. They're very content.
They're very content. They're next to us here and you can hardly hear them. Can you take us to where you ensile all of it, all this whole crop then?
Yeah. Beans are in here, actually.
So we've come to a big silage clamp, which is just a big mound covered in black tarpaulin plastic and car tyres.
There's 450 tonnes of whole crop beans, and an element of it is beans and peas as well, because we grew a companion crop of peas on some of the land.
So it's black and it's moist. It's all chopped up, tiny bit stalky, but it smells nice as well. Yeah. They love it?
Yes, yeah. They need roughage, again, to get the rumen working, because also in the diet we put in 25% grass silage goes in as well. We don't want to be feeding just like all cereals to these animals. They don't need a rocket fuel diet. They want a good mix, a bit like us. They want a good, nice, diverse diet of all sorts.
And you're trialling sowing peas and beans together in the same field.
Yeah.
How's that been going?
We're growing it because there's a theory that there's some symbiosis with the roots, which then encourages plant growth. Peas on its own, we probably couldn't grow peas around here. Peas will grow flat, but if you put them against a bean, they climb up the beanstalk. So you end up then with two harvests, effective two different products, and they work out that it's 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it equals 2.5. So you end up with a better yield in total.
And because it's a legume, it'll fix nitrogen, so it's good for next year's crop. Why does all this matter, do you think?
We will put on less nitrogen to grow that crop than we normally would do because of the nitrogen fixation. Soil feels better, looks a better colour. We've grown a cheaper diet, but a better diet for our cattle.
And it's homegrown as opposed to importing.
Yeah, we haven't got to buy it in we haven't got to run it in from wagons, or it hasn't coming in on ships. We buy fields off our neighbours, and that gives our arable farming neighbours an opportunity to put a break crop in the land, helps them with their rotation.
Well, you're one of 23 so-called pulse pioneers around the country who are looking at trying to grow whole crop pulses. And Tom Allen Stevens is an Oxfordshire farmer and here today with us because he's with the British On-Farm Innovation Network, which is all part of this big project, Nitrogen Climate Smart project.
What we're looking to do is grow peas and beans better. If we manage to get about 20% of peas and beans into the arable rotation, it's currently about 5%, and if we manage to reduce soya fed on farm by about 50%, we could lower carbon emissions from agriculture by a staggering 3.4 million tonnes a year. Imported soya coming all the way from South America, that can't be good for the carbon footprint. We can grow homegrown pulses, which you can feed to animals and you can get really good returns on that, it's a no-brainer really, isn't it?
Something you don't hear very often, cheaper and better. Boffin's Tom Allen Stevens and farmer Richard Barker with Sarah Fulkingham. Now, despite the current drought conditions in some parts of the country, the dairy sector has had a pretty successful year. The Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, which works with farmers and food producers on international trade, says that European demand for UK dairy exports reached a record £1.1 billion in the first half of 2025. That's a 20% jump from last year. Exports to the USA and Asia also rose. But how sustainable is this trend? Susie Stannard is lead analyst for dairy at the AHDB.
Well, I think it's two stories. I think we've got a story of pretty strong demand globally. You know, we've got a growing middle class and a growing population as well overseas, and their demand for dairy products has been really good. So we've seen really strong demand for things like fats particularly. So butter and cream's been going really, really well. And then the other side of the coin is the supply picture. So we've seen really, really strong dairy supplies over the course of this year. And I think we're up by 5% year on year.
We've been hearing over the last few weeks, haven't we, about the pressure on dairy production because of the drought in some parts of the country. So is this sustainable, this increased production and exports?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And I think the pressure from the drought has been very, very regional. You know, I was travelling down to Cornwall recently and it was very stark. I live in the Midlands, and actually just travelling down the M5, you sort of went from a very arid landscape, almost Mediterranean, to what was actually quite verdant and green by the time we got to Cornwall into a drizzle. Some dairy producing areas are still doing quite well, you know, for forage, but others are really, really struggling. And I think that is going to put quite a bit of pressure on some areas.
What does it mean for exports, though?
Well, we're just not seeing lower production of milk at the moment at all. We're still looking very strong, and that's because the milk to feed price ratio is really good. So the economics of producing dairy are still looking good, which means that farmers are incentivised to buy in feed. So not just forage, you know, your kind of compound feeds, you know, your cereals and so on and so forth, which will keep the milk supplies flowing quite strongly. And that will carry on as long as milk prices are looking good, and it's worthwhile farmers making the most of this opportunity.
However, Arla have just announced a drop in its milk price of 0.87 pence a litre, which isn't insignificant, is it? It says that that's because there's more milk being produced in the EU. How much difference will that make to UK exports?
Probably not too much. I mean, Arla are an EU cooperative, so if they have milk price changes, they do it across Europe. So they're more exposed to what's going on in Europe. I've just looked at the latest milk price changes for the next month, and it is a bit of a mixed bag. So we've got a lot of processors who are holding their prices. We have got some who are dropping and following Arla's suit, but we do have some processors who are increasing their prices. So it is a mixed bag, and I think the market is lacking clear direction. We often have a bit of a quiet period over the summer while traders are away, and then it's when we get back in September we'll get a clear direction as to what's going to happen with prices.
Susie Stannard from the AHDB. A new report says racist abuse is too often tolerated or even normalised in the English countryside, with many incidents going unreported by victims. Researchers from the University of Leicester spoke to 115 people and 20 community groups over 2 years for their rural racism project. They found that it wasn't just visitors to the countryside who suffered abuse, but those who are living within rural communities as well. Dr. Rachel Keithley from the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester is one of the report's authors. She told me more about what they'd found.
We really highlighted both the overt and subtle forms of hostility within rural spaces. So this included things like persistent staring and hostile body language, alongside more explicit overt instances. So these were things such as name calling, the use of racial slurs, the use of intimidation, and even physical violence as well. And it's important to note that these experiences were not isolated. They formed part of individuals' daily lives. Racism inflicted deep emotional, psychological, and actually sometimes physical wounds on participants as well. And it really eroded their sense of safety, identity, and belonging within rural spaces. And this was actually regardless of whether the instances were more extreme in nature or more subtle.
Now, we know that you actually only talked to 115 people and 20 community groups over 2 years. Is that actually enough people to get an accurate idea of what's going on?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think it's important to note that I would be wary of trying to look for statistics and saying X number of people experience this or the countryside is X racist. Because actually this research was very robust in terms of its qualitative detail. There is evidence that people's experiences of racism aren't showing up in the official data as victims don't feel comfortable reporting. And if it's not reported, the police can't record it and it's not going to show up in these hate crime statistics. Statistics might tell you how often racism happens, but we also know that statistics miss people out. And they also don't show you how it feels to experience racism, the impact it has on people's lives.
And the Countryside Alliance, Tim Bonner, the chief executive, said that racism must be confronted wherever it arises. But he also said that any suggestion that racism was more pronounced in the countryside than in other areas was, quote, not supported by the evidence.
We spoke to someone from the Countryside Alliance through the course of this research, and I think it's important to note that we're not trying to argue that the rural is more racist than urban spaces. What we're saying is that all research into racism has typically looked only at urban experiences of racism, and that actually there's unique experiences within rural spaces that aren't captured within those narratives. Some of the challenges, for example, that have cropped up is the isolation. The fact that from a victim's perspective, rural areas often lack community groups, local organisations or trained professionals to support victims and survivors of racism. Or if they do exist, most of that support is still quite urban-based.
And what are the particular challenges then of addressing some of these issues in rural communities?
Yeah, well, apart from the one I just spoke about in terms of isolation and lack of accessible support, I think there's the backlash to talking about race. And we've been struck within this research by how much backlash there has been when trying to have open conversations about race and racism in rural communities. Even very small steps towards talking about it or talking about inclusion have been provoking a little bit of resistance, showing how sensitive that the issue is. And this defensiveness can actually make, anti-racist interventions harder to implement, as efforts to challenge these biases and to challenge racism is sometimes seen as an attack on people's personal nature rather than as an opportunity for inclusion. So I think that's one particular challenge we've seen.
Did you find any positive views? Anyone who said, oh yes, our local community has reached out to us, has welcomed us?
Yes, we did. And actually, we really highlighted those as well. We found every single person shared a deep sense of joy and connection to rural spaces. So, people spoke about loving living by running water or being able to live by the moors to be able to go for walks or by a local beach to take a walk. And then on the other side, people spoke about having these communities and forging connections with community members where they didn't feel alone. Some people disclosed not experiencing racism in particular places, and this was important to highlight as well. We're not trying to just say there is only racism in rural spaces. We emphasise and will repeatedly argue for the joy, connection and community that people are forging in rural spaces as well.
Dr. Rachel Keithley from the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer was Rebecca Rooney. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.